Hello, hello. Welcome to Political Frenemies, the podcast where a conservative and a liberal Democrat, and this week a very special guest, more about him a little bit later, talk politics but still remain friends. I'm Chris Newton. I'm a historian and a former Tory defence advisor, and my co-host is Mathew Hulbert, Lib Dem activist and former councillor. Hello, Mathew. This week, a huge week in terms of political activity in Westminster, and a huge week for our podcast as well.
Absolutely, Chris. Great to be with you. I should say, as I've just said to you before we started recording there, that I am a little bit coldy today, I'm afraid. So if I'm sounding a little bit different, that is the reason why. So I've got my little tissue here. But yeah, a really big week in politics and a really big week for us at Political Frenemies, because we're a new podcast and we're building our audience. And we're just delighted today that we've got with us Mr. Iain Dale of LBC. But before we continue to introduce him, shall we bring him in?
Yeah, that's I should say that we're going to conduct an interview. We're going to get to know Iain a little bit first of all, and then after that we're going to do our usual roundup of the different political parties and looking at their week in politics. So without further ado, let's do this, shall we? Okay,
there he is.
So
hello,
Iain.
Hi,
so
Iain.
Matthew is now on the far right, which I'm sure he's pleased to hear.
I've had enough of dealing with the far right this week. Maybe more of that than none.
And Iain is in the sensible centre. And yes, so our guest, let's introduce him. He is a man of many talents, and he's done so many things in his career. Now, most of you will know him as the presenter, LBC presenter, 7 till 10 in the evening, Mondays to Thursdays. He's also a prolific author. He's just got published a book on Margaret Thatcher, which we'll talk to him about a little bit later on.
There it is.
Yeah. Excellent. Really, really nice cover as well.
Yeah, I've got this subtle display behind me.
Yeah.
I did that on the Jeremy Vine show on Channel 5 a couple of years ago with another book, and they actually made me take them down because they said that they couldn't be seen to be promoting commercial products. I said, it's a book, for goodness sake.
He's a conservative commentator. He's a podcaster. He's a podcaster of many podcasts, such as When History Meets Politics and Iain Dale All Talk. He's a blogger. He's a publisher. He's a curator of Politico's bookstore. He's a former Tory aide, including a former chief of staff to David Davis, and he's a former Tory candidate as well. It is Iain Dale. Hello, Iain.
If you haven't guessed.
Yeah.
Hey, good to be here.
Now, as I was saying to you before we went on air, firstly, I think we better address kind of your week, and you've had a very busy week doing the podcasting rounds, and thanks very much, Iain, for doing this. I know compared with a lot of the other outlets and things that you've been on, we're very small, but we're very grateful to.
Matthew said you had 100,000 listeners. That's the only way.
But you've had a busy week, and you've had a little bit of a spat as well with one Tommy Robinson. Would you like to any further reflections on the week that you've had, or has everything been essentially said?
I mean, it's so unlike me to have a spat on Twitter. I mean, this all came from another podcast I recorded. I think I recorded it a couple of weeks ago now. Andrew Gold's Heretics podcast, which I'd never heard of, but apparently it's a really, really big podcast.
I've heard of it.
And
yeah.
He's an interesting character in that he's not particularly party political, but he does have some very controversial guests, usually. And I sort of flicked through and saw the guests that he had on. I was thinking, should I be doing this? It was the likes of Tommy Robinson, Katie Hopkins, and then he'd sort of throw in Peter Tatchell. And I mean, essentially people who he thinks are heretics in some way or another. You can argue amongst yourselves as to whether I fit that category. I actually did ask him that. Why have you invited me on? And anyway, it was about an hour and a half, and it was filmed in a studio as well. And I really enjoyed it because I was being asked more, I suppose, questions that I'm not always asked on podcasts. Because sometimes, if you go on a series of podcasts, which I've been doing to promote the book, you do find yourself answering the same questions with the same answers, and it all gets a little bit repetitive. So I thought, well, look, this has got a very different audience. A lot of the people that are watching this will never have heard of me. So I did spice it up a bit. And he asked me about Tommy Robinson. And so I told him what I thought of Tommy Robinson. Not a word I normally use in polite society, but I called Tommy Robinson. Perhaps this is not a podcast to use this word on, but it begins with C and ends in T. And so, sorry, Matthew, I know you've just come back from church, so I hope that is shocking for you. And I went on to explain why I can't stand the guy. He used to, when I first was on LBC, he would ring up and come on as a caller. And then we stopped having him on because I thought, Anjem Chowdhury was another one that used to do this. And I thought, I'm not giving them the oxygen of publicity. They've not been elected by anybody. There's no reason why I should have them on. And then he started ringing up using false names. But either I worked out it was him, or the person who answered the phone worked out that it was him, and that he just then didn't get on at all. And I think his record speaks for itself. Do I really need to explain why I find him so objectionable? He's a very eloquent man. He can argue his way out of a paper bag, but he is a convicted perjurer. I mean, that's not necessarily a reason not to have somebody on, but I think he delights in stirring up religious or racial hatred. And I don't want to talk to somebody like that on my show. Why would I? So anyway, several of the people who've watched this interview, it's about, on YouTube, I think 60,000 people have watched it so far, and clearly a lot of the audience are his acolytes. So he's decided to hit back, and he's apparently posting little videos now of asking people, have you ever heard of Iain Dale? And of course, naturally, every single one says no. So he's having his little bit of fun. Well, fair enough.
Why do you think, Iain, that, I mean, I'll never understand it, certainly from my kind of political perspective, but why do you think that people like him have such a following? Do you have any reasoning for it, what it might be?
Because generally they're fellow racists or Islamophobists, if that's a word.
Right.
I mean, look, he will say, and his supporters say, look, he was talking about grooming gangs, particularly in Luton, before anybody else was. And admittedly, he did, but he was doing it in a way that was deliberately designed to stir up hatred among a particular community. I was talking about grooming gangs on the radio, using the phrase Pakistani grooming gangs, because they generally were, back in, I think, 2013. Now, I don't know whether... I think I was probably the first to go there. And I thought, well, I'm not going to tiptoe around this. These men were all of a particular culture, and they all picked on white girls. That was the common thread there. Of course, there are lots of white grooming gangs too throughout the country, but these seem to be, they were different in that they weren't, and this is not excusing them at all, but they weren't picking on a particular group of young girls. I mean, any young girl would do as far as the white grooming gangs were concerned. So I thought this was a legitimate reason to talk about them. I got a lot of criticism for that. Oh, you're just Tommy Robinson in disguise. Well, ha ha. So I think it was entirely legitimate to talk about. But as I said, as I usually say, language has consequences. If you talk about these things in a responsible way, that is fine. If you don't and use it to foment religious hatred, that is not fine.
Do you ever worry? Sorry, Chris.
No,
I was just going to ask. Do you ever worry, Iain, when you get into a thing like you did this week with Tommy Robinson? I mean, do you worry for your safety or not really?
Do I worry? Not particularly. However, if I tell you that at 6 o'clock this morning, I had a phone call from somebody who had got my phone number somehow. Who phones anyone at 6 o'clock in the morning? Now, I always have my phone on silent overnight, so I didn't hear it. But this same person then WhatsApped me sort of 7 or 8. I mean, they weren't terribly threatening messages, but I mean, they weren't particularly pleasant ones. And I get a lot of abuse on social media. I've never really feared for my safety, I have to say. But when you're dealing with people who are from Tommy Robinson's acolytes, you do sort of wonder. So I'm not trying to sort of exacerbate the situation. Let's put it that way.
Yeah, I'm very sorry about that. No one should go through that. In terms of my reaction to that, I suppose, I mean, just to perhaps to put the opposing view, and I'm not necessarily agreeing with this. I mean, they might say, well, you were kind of a rarity at that point in terms of talking about grooming gangs and these issues. Most of the mainstream media weren't. And in answer to your question, Mathew, about what's the appeal, I think Iain said it in the sense that he's very eloquent, he's intelligent. He's obviously got skills there. He knows how to organize a crowd, but I think in order to attract the mainstream, you can't do the tactics and the stuff that he does and land yourself in prison. There's always going to be a ceiling there in terms of your appeal. In relation to if you're going to do things that land you in prison, but you can't deny that he definitely has a way of persuading some people to his cause.
Yeah. So Iain, let's move on to your career now. I was thinking that I first got into politics when I was 14 and watching Prime Minister's Questions. I know it's quite sad, isn't it, at 14? But I mean, actually, I reflect now and I think that the John Major government was one of the better governments of my lifetime. But at the time, I thought it was disastrous, and I knew that I wasn't a Conservative. So I mean, looking back for you into your perhaps your teens or your early adulthood, I mean, how did you get into politics? When did you decide that you were a Conservative?
October 1978, when I was 16. Well, actually, that's not true. I can't say I was into politics earlier, but I was always interested in it. I can remember one of my first political memories would be of Richard Nixon leaving the White House in 1974, sort of standing on the steps of Marine One, the helicopter, doing that sort of salute that he did, which of course now would be described as a Nazi salute by people. So that's one of my first memories. Then I remember the day Margaret Thatcher was elected leader of the Conservative Party, and I've told this story many times before, so apologies if people have heard it, but running upstairs at 6:30 in the evening to tell my grandmother, who was ill in bed, that Margaret Thatcher was now leading the Tories, and she burst into tears. Now, Mathew, you might have burst into tears at that news, I suppose, but maybe for different reasons, because my grandmother, who was born in 1894, was always known as sort of the Queen Mother or the Duchess because she was quite regal, but actually was a bit of a feminist. And she was one of 12 brothers and sisters, lived in a small village in Cambridgeshire. And she was the first to break out of that environment. The family were butchers, and then also some of them were farmers. And she went to London to work for the post office. And I found out the other day she used to live in Brixton. And she then worked at Wembley Stadium when it started in 1923. So she was sort of, I mean, I like to think I've taken after her in the sense that I was the first in the family to break out of farming. I mean, I was destined to be a farmer, but I had very different ideas from a very, very early age. And luckily, my parents never put any pressure on me. They always supported me in whatever I wanted to do. So that, when I say I first I can pinpoint the date in 1978. It was because it was Thatcher's speech to the Tory party conference. And at that point, Matthew, you will be, again, possibly surprised to know that I was actually a member of the Liberal Party. At the end of our lower sixth, at the end of our O-level year, we had to do a month-long project, and my group decided to do it on local politics. And I remember going to interview the Liberal mayor of Saffron Walden, where I lived, and being really impressed by her. And anyway, she must have sent someone from the local Liberal Party to come and see me the next day. And this guy drove up Drive, and my mother, who was also a Liberal but had been slightly put off by the Jeremy Thorpe scandal, she was horrified that somebody should come and recruit me to a political party. But I signed up. But then 6 months later, in October 78, Thatcher was making this speech. I don't know if I'm misremembering this, because sometimes you do. But I don't know how I was watching this speech, because it would have been a weekday and should have been at school. Whether it was at half term, I don't know. But Margaret Thatcher was making a speech to the Tory party conference, and it was a sort of typical Thatcher speech. But it was, I remember thinking to myself, well, she's diagnosed all the problems that are wrong with this country, because neither of you would have been old enough to remember this, but Britain in the late 1970s was a pretty awful place in some ways, but particularly economically. The trade unions had a vice-like grip on the economy. Strikes were absolutely rife. This was just before the winter of discontent. And I remember thinking, there must be some other way. This cannot be the future. And I'd been to Germany by then, and the Germans laughed at us. They thought we were just sort of so. They looked at our strikes, and of course, their economy at that point had recovered brilliantly from the war. They had the so-called Wirtschaftswunder, the economic miracle, and everything that Germany did, we were always in awe of. And I was sick and tired of this. So anyway, she not only diagnosed the problems, but came up with a lot of solutions, or at least I thought she did. So that was, if I want to pinpoint the day that I really became fascinated by politics, I think that's the day I would choose. Sorry, it's a long answer, but you're a long podcast, so you can cope with it.
Yeah, and you said you were a Liberal beforehand. Did you find that an easy transition to make? Although Thatcher, she hadn't, you say in your book, she hadn't really fully fleshed out what Thatcherism was at that point. She was making some of the early noises towards that. So was it an easy transition to go from the liberalism of the Liberal Party to the liberalism of Thatcher?
Remember, I was 16. Did I know what liberalism even meant? Probably not. They just seemed like quite nice people, and in a sense that I always think it's ironic that generally Liberal Democrats nowadays generally seem very nice people. I mean, I've interviewed a lot of the new intake of Liberal Democrat MPs, and they would absolutely all fall into that category. But as a party, they're absolutely vicious bastards. I mean, in election campaigns, and the dirty tricks that they do, I mean, would make the other two parties blush. And the thing that the Conservatives and Labour have in common is that they both hate the Liberal Democrats. And most Conservatives would say, well, if I had to choose to have another party win the seat, if I had to choose between Labour and the Liberal Democrats, they'd always pick Labour.
I mean, how do you respond to that? So you've done so much; it's hard to cover it. But so in terms of publishing, then how did that come about?
Well, in 1995-6. I'd been running, or I was deputy managing director of a transport-related political consultancy called the Waterfront Partnership. And I'd started that up with a former colleague who was my boss at the British Ports Federation, where I was a public affairs manager. I got the Thatcher, or I say it wasn't just me, but we got the government to abolish the Dock Labour Scheme, which is a piece of employment legislation that gave dockers basically a job for life. So that happened in 1989. We then started this lobbying company up. It all went really well. I'd started a separate company, the Waterfront Conference Company, and we'd organised policy conferences on all sorts of issues in London. people would pay for a one-day conference like £320 to come. We'd have sometimes, I remember one conference we had 500 people at it, so you can imagine that was quite lucrative. And I've really built that company up, so it's doing very well. And then I had a really big falling out with my boss, or my colleague Nick, who brought his wife into work in the company, and she'd been a solicitor at Camden Council Housing Department. She was as hard as nails, and I actually, on a personal level, got on with her quite well. But she made it her mission for me to sack all of the staff who were reporting to me because she thought they were incompetent. Well, I didn't think they were incompetent. Otherwise, why would I have employed them? And I kind of knew this was going to come to a head at some point. So I started working on a business plan for a political bookshop because I'd seen one in Washington and thought, well, if there's one in Washington, why isn't there one in London? Anyway, it did come to a head, and I went on holiday to America and wrote a letter of resignation, but they got there before me. So waiting for me at home when I got home was a letter sacking me. It was a horrible, horrible period of my life. And I suppose I was a little bit naive in some ways in the way I dealt with it, looking back. They paid me off, but I mean, a fraction of the money that I should have got. And I used that money to start Politico's bookshop. And then we'd been going for about a year. We kept getting people asking for different types of political books, which didn't exist, particularly on lobbying, actually. So I thought, well, it can't be rocket science publishing. Let's start a separate publishing company. So that's where it started. We published 4 books within a very short time. One of them, actually, Matthew, you'll be interested in this. It was by Jeremy Thorpe. One day, I remember one day I picked up the phone and there was this very raspy voice at the end of it, and I couldn't make out what he was saying. Now, as it turned out, obviously he had Parkinson's, but I didn't know it was him at the time. Eventually I worked out it was him, and I thought, oh my God, this is like someone from my childhood. And and he hadn't really appeared in public since really the mid-1980s, when he was diagnosed with Parkinson's, and he'd done a lot of work for the United Nations, but hadn't really been heard of since. So I instantly saw this as a real opportunity. We're starting a new company. What better than to have somebody who had not been heard of for so long writing a book? And I spent 6 months with him helping him to write this book. And it was absolutely fascinating because his wife, Marion, had been married into the royal family before she married him. And we got to know them really well. I mean, John would come with me. We spent a weekend at their house in North Devon, which was a real experience. And anyway, we then took him to the Liberal Democrat Spring Conference in Harrogate. This would have been either 1999 or 2000. And of course, he hadn't been to one for, 20 years, more than 20 years by that point, I think. And I think his objective with this whole thing was to try and get publicly resurrected, and so that he would be put in the House of Lords. Now, that was never to happen. But I learned so much just talking to him. And of course, there were some days when he was perfectly lucid, but other days where you could barely hear a word he was saying because of his Parkinson's. But his brain was so sharp. And this is what a lot of people, I mean, when you've got a degenerative disease like that, people immediately think that you're a bit gaga, you're a bit stupid. But, his brain was incredibly sharp.
Yeah, I think because I remember we'll get onto the book in a minute, but from what I hear, Thatcher was similar in the sense that when I encountered her in 2009, she still seemed sort of very sharp, but people would say to me, well, she has good days and bad days and so forth.
Well, I mean, she was different in that she had dementia, and if you talk, I mean, I remember talking to her, it would also have been about 2009, when physically you could see that she was quite frail. But if you talk to her about the Falklands or something in the 1980s, she was on it, whereas she couldn't remember what she'd said to you 5 minutes before. And that's quite typical in some forms of dementia. I always remember, I think we were talking about newspapers. I remember Liam Fox being part of the conversation, and she said, well, of course, I never read newspapers when I was in number 10. I had Bernard to do it for me.
I love that. So Margaret Thatcher then, and this book, which I've already said to Iain, that I'm really looking forward to buying, because although her politics aren't mine, I've always been kind of fascinated with her. I do think she's a really fascinating figure from our political history, and unlike, I think, some of our more recent prime ministers, you can disagree with her, but actually know that she was absolutely committed to public service, was committed to her cause, and actually had a set of beliefs, a foundational set of beliefs, which I don't always think that current politicians, perhaps of all parties, necessarily do. So, I mean, obviously, I never met her. You obviously did many times, Iain. But even apart from meeting her, would she have always been a fascinating person for you to write about?
Yes, and if you take your own politics out of this, many politicians are fascinating characters. I mean, I got really friendly with Tony Benn, who in the 1970s I regarded as the devil incarnate. He ended up calling me his favourite Thatcherite entrepreneur. And I said, yes, but Tony, how many others do you know? And he said, well, fair point. Paddy Ashdown is, again, someone I had a really interesting relationship with. I always remember when Paddy would come on my show, particularly during the Brexit years. It's always used to make my producer almost sort of get under the table, because he knew he was going to say this. And every interview, we'd be talking about some aspect of Brexit or politics, and he would say these words. Well, of course, Iain, you and I, we've been in the trenches in politics. We've been round the course of it, haven't we? And then he'd go on to give some anecdote. And every time he said that, Matt, my producer, would literally crawl under the table laughing. He was, I've got David Davis ringing me now. Oh, well, you're far more important than him. He was, I still miss him. I mean, I couldn't believe it. He's been dead, I think, 7 years now. I remember seeing the news that he died, and I felt really emotional. I mean, we weren't like close buddies. I mean, he hadn't ever invited me around for dinner or anything, but we had a. If you can have friendships in politics, and I mean, I will admit, I haven't got many close friends in politics, even despite being involved in it for 40 years. That may say a lot more about me. I don't know, but of my political friendships, I mean, I really valued his.
In terms of the book, I have I've managed to, I bought the Kindle book just so that I could skim through it and in preparation for this interview, and I really enjoyed it, and I think it's.
You don't have to say that. You can say it was shit if you want.
No, this is genuine. I'll try not to make this sound like I'm marking a dissertation or something, but I think it's well written. I think it's very clearly written. I always tell students all the time, just write clearly. None of this like jargon sort of nonsense. I like the structure as well. It's broadly chronological, but the premiership is covered in themes. It is covered thematically, which I think is really
I did
good.
that for a reason, because it's a short book. Sorry, it's a short book, and it's part of a series that Swift are publishing on different prime ministers. They've done Harold Wilson, they've done Churchill, mine's the third. Tony Blair comes up with Steve Richards in September. And they wanted 30,000 words. And I said, well, that's a pamphlet, not a book. So I got them to agree to 45,000. But even that, I discovered it was really difficult to write a short book, or much more difficult to write a short book than a longer one. And the reason I did the Downing Street years in themes was because you can't write about everything. You have to leave things out.
Yeah.
I wasn't going to do a chapter on Northern Ireland, but then it sort of permeated the whole time. So in the end, I did. So I mean, I can be criticized for my choice of what to put in and what to leave out. I mean, I've tried to mention at least a couple of paragraphs on all of the main things, and nobody's actually so far said, I can't believe you've left that out. And I've written quite a lot about her downfall, which most people say they think is the best chapter. And I used in that, years and years and years ago, I wrote an essay as sort of dramatic fiction, recreating her last cabinet meeting. when she cried when she had to make the statement. So I've actually incorporated that in the book. I've rewrote it, but to make it fit, so it doesn't read too much like a novel. But I thought that would add some colour to it, and I think it did. And then the chapter on her sort of afterlife, people seem to be struck by the fact that I said she suffered from a form of PTSD after she left Downing Street, and I genuinely think she did, because as somebody said, she never had a happy day again.
Yeah, I was actually going to raise that. I mean, how true do you think that was? I mean, she did lots of things after her time in Downing Street, but do you think, kind of deep down in her heart, that she did never really have a really proper happy day?
No, I don't think she did. I can't think there's anything that she did that made her happy. I mean, you can say, well, the reception that she got when her memoirs came out, where she would go around the country signing copies of her book. I mean, but that, I can't imagine that fulfilled her particularly. I mean, she would have loved the public adoration, I guess, but she was put on this earth to make decisions, and there were no decisions to make for her. So, and I think also she knew that wherever she went, the functions that she spoke at, she knew she was the main attraction. She knew she had to perform. She knew that people were expecting her to be the Margaret Thatcher that they thought she was. And I think there were occasions, and I saw this a couple of times, where she almost became a caricature of herself, almost as if she was like Steve Allen doing an impression of her. She exaggerated some of the things, some of the preconceptions that people had about her. So no, I don't think she had. I mean, I'm sure there were the old happy occasion when she would meet her grandchildren, and nobody goes through 23 years of their life without the occasional happy moment. But I don't think there was ever a day when she didn't have I don't think she was ever depressed particularly. I think she came from a generation that just kept buggering on, as a phrase goes. But she was never fulfilled for the rest of her life. I think that is absolutely certain.
And just to follow up from that, I mean, John Major famously described her behaviour during his premiership as intolerable. I mean, are you critical of her about that period?
Yes, and that's the point I should make. And that, look, I am a well-known keeper of the Thatcher flame. I make no bones about that. But there was no point in me writing a hagiography. And right. I don't think I've done that. And Mary Beard reviewed the book in The Observer last Sunday, and I was so gratified with what she wrote, because she completely understood what I was trying to do. And the objective was to introduce her to a new generation, bust a few myths, but not ignore her failures. Now, any prime minister in 11 and a half years is going to have failures, and she did. And I do address them. Now, admittedly, there was a review in the Tablet the other day, which wasn't, shall we say, as positive as Mary Beard's. And the view of this guy, who I'd never heard of him, he reckoned that I waited until the concluding chapter to offer the criticisms, and he thinks I should have done that as I went along in the period that she was in power. Well, I mean, that's a fair comment stylistically, but I criticised. I mean, give you one example: the sale of council houses, which I still think was a brilliant thing to have done, but it did have consequences, and the consequences were that by the end of her period in power, 8,000 council houses were being built a year. In 1979, it's 100,000. Now we've still got, I mean, all of those houses still exist. So it's not as if they've all been knocked down and we're like 1 million houses fewer. But of course, the population has gone up. So we notice now that there is a housing shortage, and people blame it on that. Well, up to a point, Lord Copper. If you look at the amount of the extra amount of the population that there is now, partly because of immigration. Can I just put David Davies off, because he keeps ringing me? Hello? Hello, I can't talk at the moment. I'm in the middle of a podcast. Can I give you a call when it's finished? Yep. Okay, bye. Little bit of extra colour there for you. Where was I? Council houses. Yeah, look, this was the biggest transfer of wealth to the working classes in the history of this country. And I think that was a brilliant thing. I can remember in many of our towns and cities, particularly cities, these housing estates were not being looked after by the council, because councils, like governments, have to decide where they're going to put their money. And council housing estates were at the bottom of the list, and they were terrible, terrible places in many, not all, but in many cases. But within a few years, that completely changed, because if you own your house, there is a certain pride to it, which there isn't in this country if you rent it. Now, that's not the same in Germany, for example, but in this country it was. And I can remember in the 1983 general election, when I was a student, I was responsible for the campaign in the Mile Cross estate in Norwich, one of the roughest housing estates in the city. But you could tell that it was on the turn, and you could literally tell which people had bought their houses and which people hadn't. And that housing estate had never been canvassed by the Conservatives before. Well, on election night, when the ballot boxes were opened, Conservative votes poured out. And I still think that's the reason why John Major managed to scrape through in 1982, because of the overhang of council house sales. And they were still going on. Well, they still are going on. 18,000 houses a year are still being bought. I'm sure Angela Rayner will put a stop to that soon, but that is still the case. So I think that was, when people accuse Margaret Thatcher of being just for the rich, well, I think that's entirely refutable. You look at privatization, where for the first time, ordinary people bought shares in their millions. Now, they didn't always hang on to them and cashed in when they could make a profit. But again, I mean, that is capitalism writ large. People felt that they were part of the capitalist society. Nowadays, they do not, because the capitalist system has let them down. How can you be a capitalist if it's really difficult to accumulate capital? So you have a younger generation now who find it very difficult to get on the housing ladder because they haven't got a deposit. Now, you could always say, well, you shouldn't go on so many foreign holidays, or you shouldn't have Sky Television or whatever. But in the end, I bought my first flat when I was 28, and I only really did that because even in 1988, there was a danger of missing out because house prices were rising so fast even then. I think I was the only person not to make any money out of buying property in 1988, because I sold the place 10 years later for exactly the same as I bought it, because it had subsidence, but that's just my luck. But I think nowadays people think that society is treating them unfairly because they can't do what my generation did. And that is where I think if the modern day Conservative Party can get its act together and think of a policy almost akin to council house sales to help people, not by sort of giving them £20,000 each to go towards their deposit, but I mean something that will enable people to think at the next election, if I vote Conservative, I'm going to get this. And for the last since 2019, I mean, we knew what the Conservative offering was then, get Brexit done. But in the last election, there was no offering like that at all. There was nothing to spark the imagination. So I think that's really Kemi Badenoch's biggest challenge now.
And speaking of Kemi Badenoch, and I think this will be the concluding question of this section of the podcast. Now, you say that you just finished the book while she was made leader. So obviously you can offer any kind of parallels or anything like that. Do you and you speak very well about Thatcher's period as leader of the opposition, and the fact that even though she was a very good speaker, and you say that her parliamentary speeches elevated her in 1974-75, she nonetheless struggled with Harold Wilson. And she struggled initially as leader of the opposition, but she managed to turn it around. And of course, you had Gordon Rees, gave her makeover, told her got her to lower her voice, and so forth. So Thatcher was able to turn things around, even though people initially or MPs were initially regretting them voting for her. Can Kemi Badenoch draw any lessons from that period, or are we in a completely different period now where obviously we've got Farage, we're in a completely different period where it's beyond the point of no return for her, and she can't really learn from what Thatcher did there?
There are a lot of parallels to be drawn, but there are differences. Another party on the right being the main one. The other one is we have a 24-hour media that is very voracious. It wants to be fed. Kemi doesn't like the media. She doesn't like doing interviews particularly, and she's got to change that. And she knows that. I mean, I've had this conversation with her. She is learning the lessons from Thatcher's period. And when I was writing that chapter, literally every 100 or so words, I was thinking to myself, well, this is Kemi. I mean, this is what faces her. Not just, I mean, she faces a parliamentary party and a voluntary party that, okay, she won the vote in the voluntary party, but there are already sort of nervous voices. In the parliamentary party, she didn't win the majority of the votes because of the system of voting that they had. PR, Mathew, disaster. And I know that. I mean, I don't know whether I should say this, but anyway, she and I sort of occasionally WhatsApp each other, and if I've got something that I think would be useful to, I'll tell her. Anyway, she sent me a screenshot the other day, and I think it must be from Charles Moore's book, and it was a chapter called "The Leader," and she had sort of circled a passage on a page in this book, and just said, "This is my life." So I thought that was really interesting, that she's clearly genning up on what happened in the Thatcher period. And I sent her a quote. This is just before she won the contest. I said, look, this is a brilliant quote from Thatcher in 68, where she said, and bear in mind that she wasn't even she was shadow cabinet minister in 68, first speech to the party conference. And she said, we don't want just support from voters. We want their enthusiasm too. And I thought that just sums everything up. If you've got their hearts as well as their minds, and you can really energize people. And that's what happened with me. I remember in the early 1980s when I became a party activist and would do this, slogging around the streets delivering leaflets, because I was enthused by Margaret Thatcher. Well, I can't imagine Keir Starmer enthusing Labour supporters. To be honest, Mathew, I hate to say this, I can't imagine Ed Davey doing that either. But I can imagine Kemi Badenoch doing that if she's given the time to do it. And that's the key. If any Conservative thinks that getting rid of her and installing Robert Jenrick or James Cleverly or, dare I say it, Boris Johnson is going to be a magic solution to this, it absolutely is not.
Yeah, and that's certainly some food for thought there. But as we've been saying on the podcast, she doesn't look like she has a lot of time. But as you say, she has a lot of talent. She has a lot of potential there, and I just hope we get to see that before MPs decide to make a move.
Just bear in mind, the leadership rules have been changed, so you have to get 30% of the parliamentary party to sign letters. Before it was 15%, so it's actually a lot more difficult to get rid of a party leader now. Now, you can argue as to whether that was the right thing for them to do. I think in government it is. I think it is. I think to change prime minister in the middle of a term, and it's happened now too many times, and I think the Conservative Party needs to really look at that. And to my mind, they should change the whole system. If they are going to get rid of a prime minister in government, then it needs to be the MPs that pick the new prime minister, not the party. So you never get another Liz Truss.
Okay, that's as very interesting there. I mean, I would say that the MPs have largely chosen a few duds and as well, but I do understand the leader needs to have the backing of the MPs, and that's been a lot of the problems in the Conservative Party over the past few decades or so. Okay, right. Thanks very much for that. That was really interesting. Please buy the book. It's available in all good bookshops and bad ones as well. And we'll put a link as well in the description, so that's
Thank you.
if you really want to buy it, then we'll do it. I should just say this isn't a paid sponsorship thing. We're just
I'm too mean.
we're just doing it, you know. But yeah, but if you're interested, you know, do buy the book.
And can we also mention a book that Iain has edited that's coming out in September, which I happen to have written a bit for. So do you want to tell us about that quickly, Iain?
Well, I've done a series of books where basically I get other people to write them for me, which I find to be a very successful formula. Started off with the prime ministers, then American presidents, kings and queens, dictators, British general election campaigns, and the next one, now don't get too excited everyone, is British by-elections 1769 to 2025. And I've picked 88. It was going to be 50, but then people kept lobbying me to say, no, you've got to include this one. So it's grown to 88. It finishes with the Runcorn by-election. And it's 88 essays on, I think, by-elections that have maybe not changed the course of political history, but certainly had an influence on it. And I can't remember which one you've written, Matthew.
It was the one after Joe Cox's death.
That's it. And I mean, I've got all sorts of people writing in the book, some famous, some not famous, politicians, journalists, historians, academics. And it's going to be an absolute doorstep of a book, because I think it's come out at about 245,000 words. So 200,000 words more than this one. And that's coming out on the 18th of September. And then I've got another one later in the year on the Irish Taoiseach. And again, profiles of the 17 men, they're all men who've been Taoiseach of the Republic of Ireland. Because I just found one day, I thought, I know nothing about Irish politics. Why is that? They're our nearest neighbours. They speak the same language. It's based on the Westminster system. So I started sort of genning up on Irish history, and ended up doing a podcast series on the different Taoiseach. That's the plural of Taoiseach. It's spelled T-size, but it's pronounced Taoiseach. And I thought I'd get a lot of flack being a Brit doing this, because I thought somebody else must have done it, but they hadn't. So I'm looking forward to doing a publicity tour in Ireland, getting thoroughly abused for it, but we'll see.
And didn't I see you're doing an edited book on British generals as well, or something?
Yeah, that's next year's one.
Okay. I'll definitely, because I'm a military historian, so
I'll be looking out for that one. I would have got you to write a chapter in it.
I probably would have said something about Haig and how he's not a donkey or something. But anyway,
Simon Heffer's done the chapter on him, and it's concluded he absolutely was.
Okay, right. I'll be interested. But that's quite good, because a lot of the scholarship now is revisionist of that Donkey's school of thought, and I'm part of that revisionist. So it'd be good to see someone actually arguing against that and seeing what arguments they make. Anyway, this is a politics podcast, not a history one. So let's get on with the politics, and let's review the political week, shall we? So normally on this podcast, what we do is that we take the four main Westminster parties and we review their week. And what I thought I'd do this week, as Ian's the guest, this is a bit like Crystal Maze, because you've got four choices: Conservative, Labour, Lib Dem, and Reform. Which party do you want to talk about first?
Oh God. Well, Labour in government, I suppose we should talk about them.
Okay, right. Let's talk about what the government's been up to, and there's been a lot of activity from the government this week. We had the defence review, and the whole business of whether the government is or whether Labour's committed to 3% of GDP on defence in the next Parliament. They made a complete hash of that, and they've made quite a lot of sort of spending commitments, other spending commitments on public transport. Of course, there's a U-turn on winter fuel payments. There was something today about the NHS, even more spending on the NHS. Of course, they had the Hamilton by-election victory this week as well, which we discussed on our pre-show. So I suppose you could say this has been a good week for them. But Labour's making all of these sort of spending commitments. And of course, we've got the spending review next week. So obviously we'll need to see the detail of the figures there. But it just seems to me that Labour's making all these spending commitments after spending commitments, not always telling us where they're going to get the funding from. And yet, when the Tories did that, I'm not saying it's a good thing to do, by the way, but when the Tories did that, obviously with the trust budget and reforms under criticism for making like series of unfunded spending commitments as well. When the Tories and Reform do it, that's a problem. But it seems to me that Labour seems to be getting away with that. I don't know if you would agree.
I don't agree that Labour's had a good week. I don't think they've had a good week at all. I think the Strategic Defence Review was a bit of a joke in a way. It sounds as if it was saying all the right things, but did they actually mean it? To say that you've got an ambition for increased defence spending means absolutely nothing, and people know that. And then the next day, Mark Rutte, the Secretary General of NATO, says that every country has agreed to 3.5%. Well, that's like 24 hours later. And you think, well, is that joined up government? You do a strategic defence review, committing yourself to 2.5%, not committing yourself to 3%. And then NATO is saying, well, every country's agreed to 3.5%. Then Donald Trump comes on and says it should be 5%. So I think that was, in PR terms, a bit of a disaster for them. But worse than that, the winter fuel allowance U-turn is also a disaster. Because if you're going to do a U-turn, I think the lessons from history are, if you're going to do it properly. And what they've done is say, yeah, we realise we've done something a bit wrong here, so we are going to change it. We can't tell you what to, though. So the general public is thinking, okay, so it's not really going to be very much of a change. So they've now, it seems, got several months where the whole time people like me are going to put questions to them, which they won't be able to answer. Now, it doesn't take a rocket scientist to work out what something is going to cost. If you are going to change policy, you work out what it's going to cost, and then you think, well, where's that money going to come from? So to my mind, that should be announced in the spending review on Wednesday, but it seems it's not going to be. So I think in 11 months in office, nearly a year now, Keir Starmer's reputation is as a weather vane. Tony Benn used to say you can divide politicians into signposts and weather vanes. Well, he is a spinning weather vane, and I think he's now in the worst of all positions. His own MPs think he's utterly useless, and so do most of the country, and that's quite a difficult place to recover from.
And do you think he is going to sack Rachel Reeves?
No. If he sacks her, he's got to go himself, because they are so interlinked. And I don't think he should sack her, to be honest. I mean, I know Rachel quite well, and I'm not using that as a reason why I think he shouldn't sack her. I think she has been possibly constrained by him a little bit too much. But I mean, we all know what happens when a chancellor and a prime minister fall out. There's no evidence that they have fallen out, actually. So I don't see any likelihood of her being sacked. I think there are plenty of the cabinet who are in the queue before her.
Do you think that, excuse me, do you think that her self-imposed fiscal rules have constrained her to the point that she now has no wriggle room at all?
Well, she's made a huge amount of these fiscal rules. All chancellors do. It goes with the territory. But fiscal rules are often changed. I suspect there isn't a chancellor in history, really, that hasn't either wanted to or actually has changed fiscal rules. But you have to do it in a way that doesn't spook the markets. And I'm sure there are, look, I'm not an economist. I don't pretend to know a huge amount about economics, but there must be ways of at least fiddling with these rules that don't make the markets think, oh my God, we're going to do what we did when Liz Truss did her mini budget. I mean, they nearly did that. I mean, I always wondered why this didn't get as much coverage as it should have done. But I think, was it in October or November, the gilt yields went up to levels that hadn't been seen since the Liz Truss budget. And yet the media didn't really seem to take much notice of that. Now, she will have been spooked a little by that, and obviously won't want it to happen again. Well, I've got visiting dogs.
No, I mean, it goes back to my initial point about, you know, the media seeming to treat different.
Oh no!
Oh, hello.
Oh, horrible.
Well, you want to get down, do you?
And you know, about, well, the spend is bad when the Tories or Reform make unfunded spending commitments, and I do agree with you in if you just look at it in policy terms, is not a good week for Labour in the sense that they made hash, as I said, hash of the spending, the defence spending and so forth. But has it really, when I say they had a good week, it was good in the sense that they had things to say, which isn't which is a very low bar, but
well, you say they have things to say. Any politician can have something to say, but it depends what you've got to say. And I don't think that there was anything that they said this week that made you think, well, actually, you know, they are quite competent, and I'll give them a second look. Because you look at their opinion poll ratings, everyone talks about the Tory poll ratings being dire, which they are. But can you remember a government that was on 22-23%? I'm not sure I can.
No, I really can't. And as I've said on this podcast before, Ian, you only get one chance to make a first impression, and the first impression of this government was dreadful. And they've been battling to try and come back from that ever since. Obviously, there was the free school meals thing this week, which I personally welcome. You know, I think that is probably a good thing. But I mean, you know,
what happens? Yeah. What happened to parental responsibility? I mean, I'm all in favour of helping people who are literally in poverty, who can't afford to clothe, to feed their children. Absolutely have free school meals, not just breakfast, but lunches too. I'm absolutely behind that. But this idea that these things should be free for, I mean, what I suspect is almost going to be the majority of kids now. I mean, if you've got public spending choices to make, and I get the whole thought about kids perform better at school if they've had a good breakfast. I understand that completely. But shouldn't we be, I mean, it sounds preachy, I know, but surely it's a basic responsibility of a parent to give their child a nourishing breakfast before they go to school. And what we're doing here, it's a bit like having teachers teach 5-year-olds to brush their teeth. I mean, it's total. I'm sure the teachers don't want to do that, but parents have got to. If parents don't know how to parent properly, I'm going to be cruel now and say, well, they shouldn't have children in the first place. And B, and this is where I think it was a mistake to get rid of all the Sure Start things, because they were actually, I think, quite integral to good parenthood for some parents who probably did need a little bit of instruction. But we've got to have this debate. We can't shy away from it just because it sounds really mean to say, well, it's all the parents' fault.
Yeah, and I get what you're saying there, and I don't actually necessarily disagree. I mean, I think that you know, the help should absolutely be there for the poorest people, and so we'll see what the public reaction to that is. I mean, just more widely, Ian, I mean, what do you make of Starmer's first kind of almost a year as Prime Minister? And how long do you really think Labour have got to turn this around before the next election?
Well, I think the first year has been an unmitigated disaster. If you conducted a survey in the street and said to people, what do you think is the best thing Labour have done since they've been in power? I think most people would struggle to give an answer to that. Mm-hmm. I mean, I'm thinking now, well, what would I say? Because I'm sure there are things that they've done that I think probably did need to be done and are good, but I can't actually think of any off the top of my head. It started off really badly with the Freebiegate stuff, and I don't think he's ever recovered from that, because if you're painting yourself as whiter than white, and you're going to be different to the previous lot, then you better had be. And I think, again, people didn't really mind the free tickets to Arsenal or whatever, because he actually had paid for his tickets, but he was advised to go into a corporate box for security reasons. I don't think people have a problem with that, but they did have a problem with the £2,500 glasses and suits and whatever. So I think he's found it difficult to get back from that. Now, you can say, well, the election isn't for another 4 years, so does it really matter at that point? I think it has stuck in people's minds. And then when you make a big thing about growth being at the root of everything you do, and then introduce a series of measures which are completely anti-growth, even with my basic level of understanding of economics, I know that. What are you doing? And that's the one thing that I do not. I mean, other things that they've done, whether it's sort of undermining academies, you can think, well, they've done that because it's sort of basic left-wing thing. The VAT on schools, obviously, I disagree with that. But to introduce the NI rise, which everyone knows, if you put up employment taxes, then you're going to have fewer jobs and also fewer pay rises. I just think it's the economics of the madhouse.
And they seem to be saying contradictory things, don't they? I mean, and I wonder, I've said this to Chris on this podcast before, who are they trying to appeal to? Because, you know, on the 1 week, it is this big speech on immigration. And obviously I'm assuming that was trying to attract back some of the voters that have gone to reform. But then the next week, and as much as I welcome this the following week, you know, being a Lib Dem and pro-European and all of that, he did the whole thing on Europe, but then talked about a youth mobility scheme, which I welcome, but it seems to contradict what he'd said the prior week.
Well, quite. I mean, that speech, the Island of Strangers speech, I do rank alongside Enoch Powell's Rivers of Blood speech as one of the most disgraceful speeches a politician has made in living memory. But you're absolutely right on it totally contradicted what he was trying to do with the EU. And if he thinks reform voters are very stupid, which he clearly does, and that they won't notice that sort of thing, I mean, if he really was panicked by the local election results and decided that he had to make that Island of Strangers speech, which I suspect he A, didn't write a word of, and B, didn't believe a word of, I mean, that is cynical politics, isn't it?
Yeah, it goes back to the weather vane and trying to please everybody, but ending up pleasing no one, which is what he's ended up doing. Shall we move to Reform UK? Right. So Reform UK's had an interesting week. That's putting it mildly.
Well, it's maybe ended better than it started.
Yeah. So basically, they started off the week initiating the Doge initiative in relation to Kent County Council. And who said in November, Mathew, that Reform and the Tories should do some form of Doge initiative? Do you remember?
That might well have been you, Chris.
Yeah. we're ahead of the game on this podcast. But the main story for Reform UK was the fact that their chairman Zia Youssef resigned, and then he came back in a role which was kind of like a chairman's role, but not quite. So it seems like the chairman's role has been split into two. So a complete mess of a week, really. And does this ultimately reinforce those fears and criticisms of Nigel Farage and Reform UK that this is an amateur outfit, they've still got a long way to go in terms of professionalization? And does this create some kind of concern in terms of their ability to keep the poll leads in which they've managed to achieve over the past few months?
I think you're missing one really big thing there, and that was their performance in that Scottish by-election, where they came third, but they could have easily come second. They were very close behind Labour, and they came from nothing to 26%. Now that has put the fear of God up the SNP, up the Conservatives and Labour in Scotland, because they don't know what to do. Because up until this point, Reform has never really been taken seriously in Scotland. People think, oh, we voted for to stay within the EU, so reform aren't going to get much traction up here. But that fails to understand the attraction of reform, which is it's what the Matthew, but it's what the Lib Dems used to be, the dustbin vote. The plague on all of your houses, we're going to vote for somebody else who hasn't had their hands tarred by the sort of awfulness of government. And I think there's a huge constituency like that in Scotland who are fed up with the SNP because they've been in power since 2007. And although they were seen as relatively competent under Alex Salmond and Nicola Sturgeon, I think the longer a party stays in power, the more difficult it is to say, yeah, we haven't managed to fix that. I know we've been in power for nearly 20 years, but it'll be next time. It's like the drugs issue in Scotland, which is a disgrace. The number of drug deaths in Scotland is like a multiple of what it is in any other European country. And even Nicola Sturgeon finally admitted she'd taken her eye off the ball. Well, they're still going up. So, and I think a lot of voters just think, well, let's vote for somebody fresh. We may not agree with Nigel Farage on much, but at least he says what he thinks. And that is a really attractive proposition for a politician. I think the Zia Youssef stuff is fluff in many ways. It'll pass most people by. I think it is a good thing that they've got him back because he is one of their more talented people. And I think to have his mind focused on this policy area is probably a good thing too. But that is their challenge now. So who was it a couple of weeks ago I heard saying the main challenge for Nigel Farage is at some point over the next 4 years, he's got to, on a conference stage or something, saying, well, look, this is my government. Now, at the moment, between the three of us, I doubt whether we would be able to name more than 5 people who we would think maybe could be a competent cabinet minister. And that is a real challenge for them. Now, we have had governments in the past where you've had virtually people with no experience. I mean, the 1924 Labour government, although that didn't last long, did it? They were a lot of them were actually new MPs. And if reform got in, inevitably, I mean, you've got Richard Tice and Nigel Farage, but would you really want to make Lee Anderson Home Secretary? Well, I certainly wouldn't. No. Would you? I mean, James McMurdoch, I can't remember what he's accused of, but he shall we say, slightly detached from them. And you've got Sarah Potchin, the victor of the Runcorn by-election, who's an ex-Tory councillor, kind of looks the part. But for her to make her first appearance in Parliament asking a question about banning the burqa, I thought, ye gods. So I think that's where their biggest problem is going to be, to train up almost a group of people that the electorate will take seriously.
And at council level, I mean, they obviously now run these, I think it's these 10 councils, and obviously there's going to be a great focus on them. All that I've read thus far does not sound good, and I know it's early days, but we've got councillors that have left, and we've got meetings not happening, and you know, from a national perspective for reform, those councils need to be run, from their perspective at least, well, don't they? I mean, they can't afford to have mistakes.
Well, I think the problem they've got in the councils is that they have little room for manoeuvre, because there are all sorts of legal responsibilities that councils have to provide various services, which I'm not sure that reform people necessarily understood before they were elected. So it's all very well to have a Doge in Kent County Council, but their room for manoeuvre is going to be slightly limited. And the first thing they did in Kent was to take down the Ukrainian flag from the council chamber. Now, if that really was the first priority for them, I mean, what does that say? That was just a bizarre thing to do. I mean, pride flags, you can argue the toss over. I think support for Ukraine, you can't. Yeah,
I agree. And so, I mean, the chair thing, I mean, Zia Youssef, I mean, that's probably a Westminster bubble type thing. But what do you think happened there? I mean, do you accept what has been said, the spin, which is that, oh, he was just very tired and he put out a tweet?
He said that himself, to be fair. And I think, look, you both have been involved in election campaigns. He was the guy responsible for the reform election campaign. He's always struck me as a bit of a Duracell bunny, somebody who does spend every waking hour doing what he's supposed to do. So I'm quite happy to believe that that was the reason. And look, we've all done it. We've all tweeted things in haste and then repented at leisure. I certainly have on many occasions. So I think this is a passing thing. I think the interesting thing was that Nigel Farage himself, instead of flying off the handle at the resignation, issued a very supportive statement and has welcomed him back. Now that shows a certain maturity that I haven't seen in Nigel Farage before, because it's usually been his way or the highway, and he's always wanted to have complete control of whichever party he's been leading. But I think he surely either has had to come to or is coming to the conclusion that if you're going to have a party that is a national party, you can't control every aspect of it. And to their credit, they have started that process now. They've adopted a constitution, which I gather is modelled on the Lib Dem one. They've got 450 branches over the country. They've got 235,000 members, double that of the Tories. And to all intents and purposes, they have now become a major political party. And all political parties in those circumstances have teething problems. But the bigger problems are about to come when they've got to next year. Did I read somewhere today 3,000 candidates in the local elections next year, and then getting parliamentary candidates selected? I mean, that is going to be a huge headache for them. I mean, Labour and Tory and Liberal Democrats have enough problems getting good candidates together. So they've got to appear to be much more professional than certainly UKIP ever appeared to be.
And Zia,
sorry, Chris, can I just ask one final question on reform and on Zia Youssef, which is that so after he'd originally announced his resignation, I saw, and I'm sure you two guys did as well, some people on the kind of the right wing commentariat infer, without actually saying it, because they're probably too clever to actually say it outright, but to infer that, oh well, he never should have been part of reform at all, and kind of a nod and a wink to the racist element. I mean, I was appalled by that, and so in that respect, at least, I'm glad that he is back, because hopefully it means that those people can scuttle away.
The only comments I've seen to that effect have been from left-wing people who say they can't believe a Muslim can be part of reform. I mean, this is utterly ridiculous. If you actually look at reform's audiences, not just the people on the platform, I mean, I'm not going to say that they're totally representative, but there are a lot of non-white faces there. There are a lot of gay people that support reform. And that's how it should be in many ways. You don't want a political party that is monochrome and just from one part of the electorate. This idea that young people are uniformly left-wing, 28% of young people under the age of 30 are now supporting reform, which is roughly in line with the rest of the population. So, I mean, I don't support reform and I could never imagine voting for them. But people like me are going to have to make our minds up, possibly in a few years' time. Do we want 4 years of another Labour government, or would we want a Conservative Reform coalition? There's no way that they're going to get in bed together before the election, I don't think. But electoral arithmetic might dictate that that's the choice. And I have to say, in those circumstances, I know which side I'm on.
Yeah, and I've been saying similar things on this podcast as well. And in terms of Zia Youssef, I think but you must have interviewed him.
I haven't actually.
Oh, you haven't?
No, it's bizarre because we've invited him on my show time after time after time, and he will never come on.
Okay, that's interesting. But I think he is a good, whether you agree with him or not, he is a good media performer, and he's the kind of person that reform really needs.
Absolutely right. I totally agree.
Shall we move on?
Yeah, and let's move on to the Conservatives. And I suppose the main thing that you had the speech from Mel Stride about fiscal responsibility, but you also had a major speech from Kemi Badenoch as well about she's minded to leave the ECHR, but she's conducting this review, which will ultimately determine the Conservatives' position. Now, is this a good thing for her to do? Is her approach, her methodology, is that the right one, or is this kind of sort of vague sort of commitment, vague policy at the moment? Does that just reinforce people's perception that the Tories aren't really serious about sort of these issues and aren't serious about sorting out the illegal channel crossings and so forth?
Who do you want to go first?
I think
Mathew,
that was put to you, Iain.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah. Okay.
You can argue this two ways, because you can either argue that Kemi Badenoch is providing leadership, because she did say, excuse me, I think in her leadership campaign, that leaving the ECHR would not solve everything. It wasn't a silver bullet. She does seem to have come a little bit closer to wanting to leave the ECHR now. I didn't actually hear that speech, and I haven't read the whole thing, but I was listening I was doing a talk at Runnymede Conservatives on Friday night, because I lead a very glamorous social life, and on the way back I was listening to Stephen Nolan's phone in on this very subject, and he, or the BBC, seemed to portray this as her saying she does want to leave the ECHR. As I understand it, she's convened a commission to look at the pros and cons and whether it would actually work. Now, to my mind, that's a sensible thing to do, and I've got no objection to that at all. Personally, I don't think we that should leave the ECHR, and I know for many Conservatives, and I don't just mean Conservatives on the left of the Conservative Party, I mean others too, that would be a bit too much. And that I know of several people, senior people in Parliament, both on the left and right of the Conservative Party, who say they would leave the Conservative Party if they did come up with that policy. Now, would I do the same thing? I'm not sure I'm quite there, I have to say, because I think it's the sort of thing where if you just flounce out and don't fight your corner, then, well, my main thing is that I think the Conservative Party is not going to revive unless it can appeal to people who've drifted off to the Liberal Democrats over the past couple of years. Because remember, virtually all of those 72 seats that they won last time were in Conservative-facing seats. So it's all very well to say we've got to get all the Reform people back. No. I mean, ideally, you would get most of them back, because we seem to have lost this idea that political parties should be big tents. Big tent political parties win elections. Narrow sects do not. And so whatever they do, they've got to be very careful not to encourage more people to drift off on the other end to the Liberal Democrats. That to me is a real priority.
Dominic Cummings said...
people seem to think I already have, judging by social media. There we go.
I completely understand where you're coming from. Dominic Cummings, however, has said that he looked at this issue in 2020 and he said he looked at this in granular detail, and he said that he concluded that there's no other way of stopping the boats other than leaving the ECHR. Now, I'm not a legal expert in all of this, but surely a big sort of political priority for any sort of governments, for any future governments, is to sort out the illegal immigration issue. And
can you Matthew, explain to me how leaving the ECHR would stop the boats?
Can't do that, Chris.
Well, I mean, like I said, I've not looked at this in any detail. I've heard people from both sides looking at this.
I mean, but you could argue that leaving the ECHR would enable British courts' decisions to be applied. So, for example, this is a fictitious example, but there have been examples like this, where a foreign rapist has been allowed to stay in the country because it would upset his family life if he didn't. Now, I'm sure there is the odd occasion when the ECHR is found in that way, but it's a handful of cases. And to think that you just throw everything else away, I mean, you can argue from a principled state that, foreign courts should not have jurisdiction over Britain. I mean, you can argue that, and that would be, as I say, a principled stance to take in many ways. But this argument that you put yourself in the same position as Belarus and Russia, I think actually is quite a compelling one.
Iain, can I ask you, how do the talk? I mean, even in this podcast, most weeks now, we do Labour's week because they're in government, and then we do Reform's week, almost naturally. And you could almost forget that the Conservatives exist sometimes. And so how do they win back the media's attention when you've got Farage, who, whatever any of us think about him, and he's obviously not my favourite person, but he's a very good communicator. He knows how to get the press on his side, or at least reporting about him. And Kemi Badenoch, you may say she's trying her best, but it's just not happening.
Back in 1997, a few months after the election, Peter Lilly, who was Shadow Chancellor at the time, said, we have to recognise that no one wants to hear from us at the moment, and that won't change for some time. And this is exactly the same here. Peter Kyle apparently this morning said that he now regards Reform as the main opposition. Well, he clearly did that to sort of stir the pot. The Conservatives are the official opposition and will remain so throughout this Parliament. And I do believe it's partly a matter of time, but it's not wholly a matter of time. It does depend on Kemi Badenoch or reforming the party structures, reforming her official leader of the opposition's office to ensure that they've got really good people sort of organising things, coming up with new ideas, appealing to the media. Because you're right, at the moment that there's no real impetus for the media to get Conservative spokespeople on to any degree. It's possibly much more fun to have a Reform person on who probably will say something injudicious. So you've got to, I mean, we sometimes have real issues getting Conservative people on. And you think, well, it's ridiculous. And you look at some of the programs they go on, which have minute audiences, and you think, well, I mean, we have the biggest audience of any program in the evening on British radio. You think just from that point of view, maybe it's me they don't like, I don't know. But over time, I've got every confidence that will change. Her biggest problem is that she's only got a parliamentary party of 121 to choose from. So there is no way that she's going to have a shadow cabinet that is as strong as a normal shadow cabinet would be. But then again, how many of Labour's shadow cabinet did anybody know of? How many of the current cabinet could the three of us name or recognise in a sort of identity parade? But you've got to get the right people in the right jobs, and I'm afraid at the moment you've got people in some of the real controversial areas that aren't up to the job. So I think she does need to have some sort of reshuffle in the next few months.
And is Robert Jenrick going to challenge?
Well, he certainly gives the appearance of running a pseudo leadership campaign. Quite effectively in some ways. I mean, he is one of the people who've actually provided real opposition to the government. I'll give him credit for that. The Tube video I thought was a masterstroke, but he's got to be careful not to go over the top, and to follow it up immediately with one on the Attorney General, which again was quite good and quite compelling. I just wonder whether that's the right strategy. And he certainly went over the top on his language on immigration a few months ago. Whether he would challenge, he's only going to challenge if he thinks he would win, and I'm not sure he would think he would win at the moment, because there is a move for Boris Johnson to come back. I mean, and he certainly, I know for a fact, wants to come back, and there are even talks of changing the leadership rules so that the leader doesn't have to be an MP. Now, I think the party would have to be in pretty dire straits to allow all that to happen. But
of course, that is the case now. I love Canadian politics, and that is the case with the Conservative Party in Canada. Is that Poilievre lost his seat, but has remained the leader, and they have a leader in Parliament to ask questions, and he's doing all of these press conferences before trying to win a seat back. So I mean, it's odd, but I guess it could happen.
And the other thing is that we shouldn't just assume that Jenrick would walk it, because you've got Boris, but you've got James Cleverly as well. He's clearly doing something. You've also got Penny Mordaunt as well, who is looking for a seat and might be successful at some point. So it's not so. The next leadership contest, if it ever happens, it's not going to be straightforward, I think.
No. I mean, Penny Mordaunt should have been the leader before the last election, and I said publicly then that I thought she should be. I think she has far more electoral appeal than any of the others. She won't challenge Kemi. She's not. Her makeup is not to do that sort of thing. But and I don't think she would try and change the party rules even to be a candidate if Kemi did fall by the wayside. But I think she, of all of the people that you've mentioned there, I think she's the strongest in terms of electoral appeal. But she does now suffer some sexist comments, and I genuinely think it's because she's blonde, in that people still in 2025 think that blonde women are somehow less intelligent than others. And the comments I've heard from senior Tories, oh, well, she hasn't quite got the intellect. You think, oh, fuck off.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, there may be reasons to have a go at her, but that clearly isn't one of them. Shall we move on to the Lib Dems week, Chris?
Yeah.
For the final couple of minutes that we've got. I don't think there's a fat lot to say, is there really? But
there is. Iain Dale interviewed Ed Davey this week.
I was just about to say, how was Dear Leader? Was he well?
Well, I mean, I'll leave you to tell us, Matthew, because I'm sure you watched every minute. See, this is the loyalty that he has to his party leader.
I saw some clips. I've had a busy week. What can I tell you? But I saw the clip actually where you were quoting an apparent friend of yours, and you asked Dear Leader, Mr. Davey, why anyone should give a rat's arse about the Liberal Democrats.
Well, my friend actually said, give a fuck, but I didn't think I should say that at 7 o'clock on the radio. I thought that was... I mean, sometimes doing these hour-long sessions, you build up to more difficult questions. But I've always thought with Ed Davey, he responds much better to difficult questions than easy ones. So I thought he answered that fairly well. In fact, I thought over the hour that was the best interview he's ever done with me. He answered most questions quite straightforwardly. Sort of wriggled a little bit on the post office because obviously that came up from a listener. Then right at the end, a woman came on and asked him about the whole trans issue, where he was very unconvincing, I thought, because clearly the Supreme Court decision shattered Lib Dem policy on this issue.
Well, and can I tell you, Iain, that I can tell you that lots of Liberal Democrats were not happy at all with his comments and thought that he should have better represented party policy in that answer.
Well, I'm sure they did. I mean, his answer was effectively, well, we respect the Supreme Court decision, so i.e. we're going to have to change our policy. He didn't quite go that far. Well, I mean, we can talk for hours on that subject, but
we can.
I did point out to him that his party had expelled people from holding views that were upheld by the Supreme Court, and were they going to change their policy on that, which he didn't really go there.
Now, to be fair to you, Iain, and as you've said to me offline this week, you do have the Lib Dems on regularly, and I appreciate that. But do you have any comfort at all from my view, which is that given that we are now a parliamentary party of 72, the largest Commons group for a third party in a century, that actually we don't get anywhere near the coverage that really we should, given that?
It's a really difficult one, because I've always taken the view that parties outside the government and the official opposition do deserve to have time. So I have the Greens on quite a lot. I have the SNP on. I mean, okay, they're a slightly different kettle of fish, and I mean, you can argue it both ways in that they've only got 9 MPs now, so why would we bother having them on? Hardly at all. But they do run Scotland, so they therefore, and we've got Liz Saville-Roberts from Plaid Cymru on Cross Question this week. So I deliberately go out of my way to have other parties on. Now, do the Liberal Democrats get fair coverage elsewhere? I don't know how I actually don't know what the Ofcom rules are on this outside elections. I'm not sure there are any. So everybody has to make their own judgments. But if the Liberal Democrats come up with interesting policies or campaigns, that's the way to get on any broadcast channel. And I'm not sure, although you've heard me say before, I have quite a high regard for the new Liberal Democrat MPs I've been speaking to. I'm not sure any of them have possibly, I mean, obviously this causes me great pain, but the new Tunbridge Wells MP, Mike Martin, I mean, he has really made a name for himself on the defence issue. So it's possible to do, but in a way, it's up to them. You can't force media establishments to invite you on just because you happen to have a party label. You've got to have something to say. And okay, there are lots more panel type shows now, whether it's on the BBC, Us, GB News, whatever. I mean, I don't know what the Lib Dem attitude to going on GB News is, but I mean, quite a lot of Labour MPs have now started going on there, and I think, I mean, why not? I mean, they have built up an audience that is sort of akin to Sky News, obviously nowhere near that of LBC, I should point out. But you can't regard it as a right to be invited onto the media. There's got to be a reason to do so.
Well, it's certainly my view that we should go on everything we're invited to go on. I mean, you know, I think we've got to get out there, and I do worry actually that sometimes my party is invited onto things and no one is put up, which I don't think that's good at all.
I have to say that I do not accuse the Liberal Democrats of that. Generally, if we ask for someone, they provide them. They've got a very good press officer that we deal with called Gareth, who always makes an effort to get someone. I mean, obviously, there are going to be the odd occasion where you genuinely can't find anyone. I wish I could say the same for the other parties.
Right. Well, that's about it, I think, Chris.
Yeah, no, this has been a really sort of fascinating hour and a half, actually, and we've covered a lot of ground, haven't we? It's been once again, thank you very much, Iain, for doing this and for taking your time. And yeah, it's been really interesting, and there's a lot that's come out of the interview. And I just want to extend my thanks and gratitude once again.
Well, thank you for having me on. I've enjoyed it.
Great to have you on, Iain, and to our viewers and listeners, really hope you've enjoyed that. If you're new to us because you've come here to hear what Iain's had to say, please do stay with us. Please do all the internet things, subscribe and like and all of that stuff. We're going to have more interesting guests on in the future, and then there's our regular episodes where it's just me and Chris.
Hang on a second. More interesting guests or more interesting guests?
More fours, interesting guests. And yeah, we're really looking forward to that. But yeah, if you're new to us today, do stay with us. We'd really appreciate it.
Yep. Thank you, Iain. Thanks for listening. And next week we'll be discussing the spending review, so another sort of important packed week. But until then, we will see you on the next episode of Political Frenemies. Goodbye.
Bye.